On behalf of Indiana University Northwest, I'd like to welcome you guys all to today's program. My name is Matthew Lawson. I am the student government president here on campus, and I will be your MC for today's events. Events like these are proof that citizens of all walks of life are making a concerted effort to address racial inequalities in the American criminal justice system, and shows that people are serious about instilling long-term change. And saying that, I'd like to welcome you guys all to today's events and hope you enjoy the show. And just a quick reminder before I introduce the first installment that this event is being broadcasted live to all Indiana University campuses, so be sure to silence your phones and keep chatter to a minimum. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you guys to the first performance, and that is the Women's A Cappella Choir from Morton High School in Hammond.
Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound out as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
to thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to perform for you today. My name is Connie Pruitt, and I'm the vocal director from the Hammond Academy for the Performing Arts. These lovely ladies are just a small portion of the performers that I have that I teach at that school. Please give them one more hand before we have our last piece. The next piece and our last piece that we'll be performing for you is actually in an African language. The translation is pretty much, "The honeybird carries sour milk. It is no good for my child, so let us chase him away with a big bang." And obviously we're not quite talking about honeybirds, if you know what I mean.
Takana tilo tilo ufeteni gemlomo. Takana tilo tilo ufeteni gemlomo. Difero maso sanawa. Sapenge kabuswabo. Bum 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 bum. Takana tilo tilo ufeteni gemlomo. Takana tilo tilo ufeteni gemlomo. Difero maso sanawa. Sapenge kabuswabo. Bum 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 bum. Shisa. Dubla matati. Dubla dubla. Dubla. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla matati. Dubla dubla. Dubla. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla matati. Dubla dubla. Dubla. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla matati. Dubla dubla. Dubla. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla kapaka doleo luka. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla 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 doleo. Dubla kapaka doleo luka.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you once again to the Morton's Women's A Cappella Choir. You guys did a great job. If we can have another round of applause for them. You guys are great. You know, it's really easy for campuses and universities to say that they are student-centered, but we all know that actions speak louder than words. And whether it be prompt, insightful email responses, showing up to almost all student-led events, or ensuring that students' opinions are represented in a variety of different matters here on campus. The person I'm getting ready to introduce truly embodies what it means to be student-centered. And so I'd like to ask you guys all to join me in welcoming to the stage Chancellor of IU Northwest, William Lowe.
I wondered who you were talking about. Well, thank you, Matt. And good afternoon. And in behalf of our entire campus community, welcome to Indiana University Northwest, and a special welcome to our guest, Professor Michelle Alexander. I'm William Lowe, as Matt indicated. I'm Chancellor here at IU Northwest. Professor Alexander, we thank you for visiting our campus and look forward to a stimulating and thought-provoking program. Thank you, let me add my thank you, to the members of the Girls A Cappella Choir from Morton High School for celebrating with us. Well done, and a good example of the arts do belong in public schools, don't they? And let me recognize the IU Northwest offices and colleagues whose financial commitments make today's event possible. Our principal contributor is the Office of Academic Affairs, whose leadership reflects the academic significance of a common reading on a university campus. We also thank the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs and the Office of Student Activities for their support and help with arrangements. We owe a very special thank you to Vice President James Wimbush and the Indiana University Office of Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs. Their support includes making it possible to live stream today's event to all IU campuses, ensuring that students, faculty, and staff throughout IU can be part of today's discussion. So welcome, students and colleagues at our other IU campuses. It is good to have you with us. Vice President Wimbush is with us today, and I ask him to stand so that you can join me in thanking him, along with our other IU Northwest colleagues, for their essential support. Vice President Wimbush. Events such as today's highlight our campus's long-standing commitment to diversity, inclusion, and community-based engagement, essential components of the IU Northwest academic mission and strategic purpose. For more than half a century, IU Northwest has served one of the very important and traditional purposes of a university campus as a neutral forum where members of the campus and Northwest Indiana communities can together explore complex and not infrequently controversial issues. Our One Book, One Campus, One Community initiative brings us together around a common campus reading to build an intellectual and social rapport among our students, staff, and faculty, and the Northwest Indiana community through the collective experience of reading, reflection upon, and critical discussion of challenging ideas and themes that engage important issues. At this time, please join me in thanking the members of the One Book, One Campus, One Community Committee who planned today's event. Committee colleagues, please stand and be recognized. This year's selected book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, has given our campus much to discuss, as many of the themes are not only timely, but hit close to home. Certainly, topics like the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and reentry barriers are discussed in our classrooms, but they're also part of the everyday lives of some of our students. We, like many other regional urban institutions, see the impact of mass incarceration on the families and communities and in the experiences of our students, who, in some cases, do not succeed. But perhaps the larger impact is among the potential students who never make it to college. The recent focus on tensions between police and communities refocuses national attention on mass incarceration and the premises on which it is built, like a drug war that failed decades ago. Recent events have provoked questions across the full range of American opinion about strict enforcement and incarceration for minor offenses that embed tensions between law enforcement and communities, and through the proliferation of felony convictions, creates a class of permanent social and economic outsiders who will find ways to survive and spend their time that most of us, and certainly the police, will probably not like. What has become clear in recent months is that all communities want to be able to support the police and the justice system. The credibility of our justice system relies on everyone seeing its operation as fair and equitable, and I think that it is widely recognized that we find ourselves at a threshold when choices can have a profound effect on the future of our country and society. After all, it says something when even columnist George Will thinks that mass incarceration is a problem that we cannot ignore. Meaningful change for the better usually starts with shared, frank discourse, which is the purpose of today's forum, to encourage the community conversation and thoughtful examination of the many and often opposing ideas that characterize difficult problems. Without a doubt, Professor Alexander will give us plenty with which to engage today and in the days ahead. Thank you once again for being with us today and your willingness to be informed, engaged citizens. I would now like to bring back our MC, Matt Lawson, an IU Northwest political science student, to formally introduce Professor Alexander. Matt will be graduating this May, and while the leadership that he brings to our campus as the Student Government Association president will be missed, we wish him all the best as he pursues his aspiration to become a lawyer. Matt?
So I guess I can bring my notes up here. Thank you, Chancellor Lowe. And now I would like to introduce today's speaker. Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar. She has taught at a number of universities, including Stanford Law School, where she was an associate professor of law and directed the civil rights clinics. Prior to entering academia, Mrs. Alexander served as the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California, where she coordinated the project's media advocacy, grassroots organizing, and coalition building and litigation. The project's priority areas were educational equity and criminal justice reform. And it was during these years at the ACLU that she began to awaken to the reality that our nation's criminal justice system serves more of a caste system than a system of crime prevention or control. In 2005, she won a Soros Fellowship, which supported her in the writing of The New Jim Crow, a book that has received rave reviews and is the reason for which we are all here today. Ms. Alexander graduated from Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University. And following law school, she clerked for judges on both district and the Supreme Court. Ms. Alexander spends most of her time now as a freelance writer, a public speaker, and consulting with advocacy groups committed to ending mass incarceration, and most important, raising her 3 children, which herself considers to be the most challenging and rewarding job of all. So I'd like to ask you guys all to join me in welcoming to the stage the author of The New Jim Crow, Professor Michelle Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, I'm just so thrilled to be here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm kind of short, so I'm going to move this down. It's just wonderful to be here and to see so many of you here for this conversation when you could be anywhere else, a dialogue about race and justice in America. I'd like to dedicate my talk tonight to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Last week, our nation paused to celebrate his life and legacy. And I find that in many of these celebrations of Dr. King's life, we fail to appreciate what he has truly challenged us to confront and to do in our own daily lives. And I would be standing here before you if I'd be lying if I did not admit that I come here today with deep concern and some trepidation. I feel the weight of this moment, this particular moment in our history. As we enter this new year, 2015, I firmly believe we are approaching a fork in the road. Of course, it's always tricky business to make predictions or assessments in the midst of great crisis. Dr. King himself pointed out that difficulty nearly a half century ago. He said, quote, "Whenever I am asked my opinion of the current state of the civil rights movement, I am forced to pause. It is not easy to describe a crisis so profound that it has caused the most powerful nation in the world to stagger in confusion and bewilderment," end quote. Well, in recent months, as our nation has reeled from Michael Brown and Eric Garner's senseless killings and the refusal of consecutive grand juries to issue indictment, confusion and bewilderment has flowed. Flowed as tears, rage, shame, disbelief, and more than a bit of denial. This particular crisis may feel sudden and new to many, particularly if you're white, but its roots are as old as the country itself. We continue to live the paradox of a nation founded with a bold preamble that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while at the same time denying those basic civil and human rights to slaves and writing to in our original Constitution the rule that black people counted as only 3/5 of a human being. The paradox of a nation born with the lofty ideals of equality and freedom, but extending those ideals primarily to wealthy white men, is the founding paradox of our nation, and it remains a paradox to this day, even now, as a black president sits in the Oval Office. We have inherited both the glorious promise and the ugly paradox, and yet too often we close our eyes and refuse to acknowledge the painful implications. On days that come around just once a year, when we gather to honor Dr. King, his life and legacy, it is too often to be tempted by romantic visions of the past, struggles, and rosy assessments of the present. But such revisionism does not serve the dream that Dr. King gave his life for. This is not to deny, none of this is to deny the extraordinary gains that have been made in many spheres. I would dishonor the sacrifices of people like Dr. King and Ella Baker and many, many others if I did not acknowledge that my own life has been greatly, drastically improved by their courage, their sacrifices, their advocacy. But if we're going to ask ourselves honestly how far we have come, where do we go from here, what is truly necessary as we work for justice in this new time, this new age, then I think we must first pause and ask ourselves, how do we measure progress? We could measure it in all kinds of ways. The number of people who are CEOs or leading Fortune 500 companies, the number of black and brown politicians or presidents, or the number of people with 2-car garages and SUVs. We could measure our progress in purely materialistic terms. Do we have as much stuff as we think we should? Stuff like money, cars, degrees, and titles. Measuring progress in this way seems to make sense in a capitalist society where the goal is to compete to get more stuff. There are winners and losers, and everyone says they want to get ahead. Very rarely do we stop and ask, get ahead of whom? And what will happen to them? Those who are left behind. I want to suggest that there is another way to measure progress, one that seems to have been forgotten in the years since Dr. King and Malcolm X were laid to rest. It's not a new measure by any means. To the contrary, it's very, very old. For centuries, it has been said by numerous philosophers and theologians that any society, any civilization must be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members and its prisoners. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would surely agree with that assessment. Jesus himself said, "What you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me." When I stand here before you and consider how we in America fare when judged by this measure, how we treat our most vulnerable members and our prisoners, I cannot help but think of the millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, who are cycling in and out of our criminal justice system today in this post-King, post-civil rights era, a time when our prison population has more than quintupled and millions of people are now permanently locked up or locked out, stripped of the very civil and human rights that Dr. King and so many others risked their lives for and some even died for. It's a time when a black man, a father, can be choked to death by the police on video, begging for his life, for the crime of selling untaxed cigarettes, and a grand jury comprised of men and women, American citizens, could say no crime occurred at all, snuffing out the life of a black man over so petty an offense is no crime at all. It's a time when our collective answer to the violence that persists on the streets of Chicago or New Orleans or Detroit and beyond has been more violence. That's been our answer. For we must never forget that imprisonment itself is a form of violence. It is legalized, state-sponsored violence, but it is violence nonetheless to take a person out of his home or off the streets at gunpoint and put him in a cage. Even if you have a badge, that's violence. And it's difficult to imagine that Dr. King would have believed that in communities ravaged by poverty, homelessness, and despair, that the answer could be simply more violence, that we could punish and threaten our way to peaceful communities, to a place of justice. Today, a prison industrial complex, a prison system run for profit, a system of mass incarceration has been born. It is a system unprecedented in world history, and it is one that is so violent, so brutal, so unrelenting in its punitiveness that many Americans can scarcely believe the truth about this system when confronted with the facts. And for poor people and people of color, this system extends far beyond the prison walls, into the streets of Ferguson and New York and Chicago, into rural Louisiana and beyond. Once this system targets you, sets its sights on you, it's nearly impossible to escape its grip. It's constant surveillance and control. The whites-only signs have come down, but new signs have gone up. Notices placed in job applications, rental agreements, loan applications, welfare forms, school applications, petitions for licenses, informing the public that the millions of people now branded criminals and felons are not wanted here. Discrimination is now perfectly legal against them. Lynch mobs may be long gone, but the threat of police violence is ever present. A wrong move or a sudden gesture can mean massive retaliation by the police. A wallet can be mistaken for a gun. It is a system that has arisen out of the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow, a system that has branded tens of millions of poor people in this country, criminals and felons, shamed and scorned, relegated to a permanent second-class status for life. It is a system that rests on the premise that some lives simply don't matter. So if we're serious and we're going to ask the question, how much progress has our nation made in achieving the dream that inspired the Civil Rights Act? the dream that fed the courage of those who marched in Selma, that I think we've got to ask ourselves whether we continue to create and maintain systems and structures that guarantee the exclusion, suffering, and oppression of others. If we're going to measure progress, we need to look not up to the top of the pyramid, to Barack Obama, for evidence of progress, but down, and ask ourselves, how do we as a society treat the most vulnerable as well as our prisoners, not how well the relative few, the powerful, the rich or famous are doing. And when we ask ourselves that question, an uncomfortable reality begins to emerge. We must confront an inconvenient truth, the truth that we in America have done it again. We have rebirthed a caste-like system in this country, a new Jim Crow. Now, I recognize that this may sound extreme to many, as it once did to me, before my eyes were finally opened and I could see what was hidden in plain sight. But the truth is, today there are more African American adults under correctional control, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. And as of 2004, more African Americans were denied the right to vote than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, explicitly denying the right to vote on the basis of race. Of course, during the old Jim Crow, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today in many states, felon disenfranchisement laws now accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. In many large urban areas today, more than half of working-age African American men have been saddled with criminal records and are thus subject to legal discrimination for the rest of their lives. They can be denied the right to vote, automatically excluded from juries, and legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and basic public benefits, relegated to a permanent second-class status. The truth is, we have become the most punitive nation in the world, and the roots of our punitiveness have much to do with race. Mark Maurer, the executive director of the Sentencing Project, published the results of research showing that the most punitive nations in the world are the most diverse. The most lenient, the most compassionate nations are the most homogeneous. It seems that an aspect of human nature is a punitive impulse towards those we label the others. And so perhaps it should come as no surprise that a vicious backlash against the civil rights movement, combined with the economic collapse of inner-city communities across America, led to the birth of a penal system unlike anything the world had ever seen. Our prison population quintupled in 30 years, going from around 350,000 in the 1970s to more than 2 million today. We now have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. No other country in the world incarcerates such a large percentage of its racial or ethnic minorities. But this can't be explained simply by crime or crime rates. Crime rates have fluctuated over the past 30 years and are currently at historical lows, but incarceration rates for decades consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates have moved independently of each other in this country. Imprisonment, especially black imprisonment, has consistently soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what has accounted for the staggering increase in imprisonment, if not crime and crime rates? Well, we know the answer. It's the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. A literal war was declared and waged almost exclusively on poor communities of color, even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. But that's not what you would guess. By taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which have been overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. Since the drug war began in the 1980s, more than 40 million people have been arrested, primarily for nonviolent, drug-related offenses, the very sorts of crimes that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class, white communities and on college campuses, but go largely ignored. They've been arrested, branded, and then ushered into a parallel social universe in which basic civil and human rights no longer apply. And let me be clear that this has been a literal war. Many Americans were shocked to see military equipment and vehicles on the streets of Ferguson, local police outfitted with riot gear, tear gas, and grenades, automatic weapons. What many people don't realize is that since the drug war has been announced, the Pentagon has been busy shipping to local police departments, large and small, throughout this country, military equipment, retired from the battlefields in Iraq and sent to your hometown, here in the USA. SWAT teams are now routinely used in poor communities of color for routine drug arrests, even for simple possession of small amounts of drugs, like marijuana. Perhaps you heard recently about the SWAT team that burst into a home in Atlanta, breaking down the door in a no-knock raid and tossing a flashbang grenade that landed in a toddler's crib, blowing a hole in the child's chest. What was the SWAT team looking for? A small amount of drugs they believed were possessed by a man's nephew who didn't even live there. The SWAT team tore the house apart in the search for drugs, but found none. The child survived, but was placed in a medically induced coma. The boy is now in rehabilitation, but doctors fear he has suffered permanent brain damage. But then again, maybe you didn't hear about that case, because these routine casualties of war almost never make the news. And one of the reasons they don't make the news is because these tactics are not used in middle class or upper middle class white neighborhoods, though drugs can certainly be found there. These tactics are reserved for the hood. But as I describe in some detail in my book, efforts to challenge the racially biased enforcement of our drug laws are no longer allowed in our courts of law. The U.S. Supreme Court has granted the police license to behave like warriors. It has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Supreme Court has authorized the police to stop, frisk, search just about anyone, anywhere, so long as they get consent. And what's consent? Consent is a police officer walking up to a kid on the street, and the officer has one hand on his gun, and he says, "Son, put your hands up in the air. Will you put your hands up in the air so I can frisk you, see if you got anything on you?" Kid says, "Uh-huh." That young man just waived his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. The police do not have to have any evidence, no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause to frisk that young man, to search him, to interrogate him, because they supposedly got consent. Now, what happens if the young man says, "No, officer, I'm not answering any questions. No, you cannot search me. No, you cannot frisk me"? Well, then the police do it anyway. And then it's their word against a young black man in a court of law about what was said on that dark street corner one night. And if you try to go to court and argue that there's been blatant discrimination, that the drug sweeps have been happening only in poor black communities, you try to offer statistics to show the extreme racial disparities, the U.S. Supreme Court will close the door before you have an opportunity to say a word. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States. It's ruled explicitly that it doesn't matter how overwhelming the evidence of racial discrimination might be, how extreme the racial disparities. It doesn't matter how much statistical evidence you might have, unless you can offer proof of conscious intentional bias, tantamount to an admission by a police officer or a prosecutor of racial bias. You can't even state a claim for race discrimination in our criminal justice system today. Now, of course, you might say, well, it's reasonable to ask for some proof of discriminatory intent. But the problem, of course, is that in this so-called age of colorblindness, everyone knows better than to state their racial biases and stereotypes out loud. Police officer is not likely to say, well, yes, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him, the reason I frisked him was, well, because he was black. Prosecutor is not likely to say, well, yeah, Your Honor, I would have given a better plea deal, or I would have cut him a break, but you know where he's from. He's black. He's from the other side of town. He's no good. You know where he's headed. No, most police officers and prosecutors, like the rest of us, know better than to state their racial biases and stereotypes out loud. But more importantly, so many of the biases and stereotypes that drive discretionary decision-making in law enforcement today operate on such an unconscious level that many well-meaning, well-intentioned officers can't even admit to themselves their biases. A well-intentioned, well-meaning officer may see a group of young black kids walking down the street and say to himself, oh, I'm going to pull over, jump out, check these kids out. That officer may not be meaning those young people any harm. But that same officer wouldn't even occur to him to jump out of the car and have some white kids heading home from school spread eagle on the street, interrogated, their backpacks rifled through. Wouldn't even occur to him. That officer doesn't mean any harm. It'd be unfair to say he's a bad cop. But these unconscious biases and stereotypes have infected all of us. And they lead to enormous racial disparities in our criminal justice system. Disparities which the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled we cannot even challenge in a court of law. The U.S. Supreme Court has virtually immunized the system of mass incarceration from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that the U.S. Supreme Court once rallied to the defense of slavery and Jim Crow in their day. The impact of all of this, the final result has been to create a vast new racial undercast in America. Yesterday, I was in the Chicago area, a place that is a virtual case study. It's a place where the impact of the drug war and the rise of mass incarceration has been particularly severe. In less than 2 decades after the drug war was officially launched by President Ronald Reagan in 1982, President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan that turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And just 20 years after that war was announced, the Urban League in Chicago released a report that revealed that fully 80% of the adult black male workforce in the Chicago area had now been saddled with criminal records and were subject to legal discrimination for the rest of their lives. The drug war was driving the sudden explosion in incarceration rates in Chicago, and about 90% of those sentenced to prison for a drug offense in Illinois were African American, even though they were no more likely to be guilty of drug crimes than whites. It's difficult to overstate the impact of mass incarceration on the life course of young black men, men who could have been destined for college if we had invested in education rather than incarceration, instead of dooming them to a prison cell. Consider the facts. By the year 2001, there were nearly 20,000 more black men in the Illinois state prison system than enrolled in the state's public universities. To put things in sharper focus, consider this. In 1999, only 992 black men received a bachelor's degree from an Illinois state university, while roughly 7,000 were released from state prison that year just for drug offenses. Where are these young men? Well, they're not so young anymore. Where are these men now? Well, mostly they are still cycling in and out of prison or trapped in the vast new racial undercast, struggling for survival, forced to check the box on employment applications, legally denied access to housing, locked in a permanent second-class status. But what about their children? Where are they now? Well, if you really want to know why there is so much violence and hopelessness on many streets in Chicago and beyond, then you may want to remember that many of the young people who are acting out on the streets today are the children of the men who were taken prisoner in the early days of the drug war, robbed of their futures, robbed of hope, and entire neighborhoods ripped apart, communities destroyed. But I am not here to bring you only bad news. There is good news. And the good news is that people are finally waking up. Yes, we're waking up in cities and small towns from coast to coast. People are waking up to the insanity of the drug war, and for the first time in 40 years, rates of state imprisonment are on the decline. Not declining by much, but at least they are no longer on the rise. People are waking up from their colorblind slumber to the realities of race in America. The events of the past several months, beginning this summer in Ferguson, have jolted many, many Americans awake. I think a time comes when the truth stares you in the face, daring you to look away and say nothing. But deep in your soul, you know that a breaking point has been reached, and that if you avert your gaze or change the subject, you will betray not only yourself, your children, and your community, but all those who risked their lives so that black children would not have to be told that in the eyes of the law, their lives don't matter. That moment was reached when Michael Brown was gunned down and the young people of Ferguson stood up. It was not the brazen killing of a young unarmed black man by the police that forced an end to the silence. To the contrary, what happened was nothing new. Isabel Wilkerson, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, recently published an excellent essay in The Guardian pointing out that the rate of police killings of black Americans today is nearly the same as the rate of lynchings in the Jim Crow era. She writes, quote, "Not terribly long ago, in a country that many people misremember if they knew it at all, a black person was killed in public every 4 days for often the most mundane of infractions, for taking a hog, making a boastful remark, for stealing 75 cents. For the most banal of missteps, the penalty could be an hours-long spectacle of torture and lynching. No trial, no jury, no judge, no appeal. Now, well into a new century, as a family in Ferguson, Missouri, buries yet another American teenager killed at the hands of authorities, the rate of police killings of black Americans is nearly the same as the rate of lynchings in the early decades of the 20th century," end quote. About twice a week, or every 3 or 4 days, an African American has been killed by a white police officer. This figure excludes, of course, Trayvon Martin, who was killed by a self-appointed neighborhood watchman, and Jordan Davis, who was killed by a white man for playing his music too loud. Those types of killings are not included in the statistic because these young men were not killed by the police, they were killed by vigilantes. Isabel Wilkerson acknowledges that there are many differences between the violence of the past and what happens today, but she is quite right that there are important parallels. Images and stereotypes built into American culture since the days of slavery have persisted to this day, mutating and changing form over time. As she puts it so plainly, quote, "Last century's beast and savage has become this century's gangbanger and thud, embedding a pre-written script for subconscious bias that primes many to accept what they were programmed to believe about Black Americans, whether they are aware of it or not. What happened that summer day when Officer Wilson pulled the trigger multiple times as Michael Brown fled and ran away from the police vehicle was nothing new at all, rooted in thoughts and habits of mind that are centuries old. But the young people in Ferguson had had enough. They were not going to allow the police to leave Michael Brown's body lying in the street for 4 hours while the authorities scrambled to get their story straight. These bold and courageous young people took to the streets and scrawled on handmade signs 3 words eerily reminiscent of eras we supposedly left behind: Black Lives Matter. And because of their courage and their conviction, and the thousands of others who have taken to the streets in recent months to protest a fundamentally unjust system, I have hope, as I stand here today, that we will eventually reach the promised land that Dr. King glimpsed the night before his death. Bill O'Reilly of Fox News has said the Ferguson protesters should be ashamed of themselves, now that it appears that even the U.S. Justice Department will not indict Officer Wilson for the killing of Michael Brown over an altercation and argument about jaywalking. But I can tell you that when I think of those protesters, I feel nothing but pride. And I am confident that Dr. King would be bursting with pride as well at the courage of the nonviolent young protesters who faced down the riot gear and tear gas and who were willing to risk their lives for justice. In recent months, we have seen the reemergence of a bold, radical spirit and a fierce commitment to racial justice that we have not seen on this scale for a long, long time. And while it has become nearly ritual and routine to reduce Dr. King's words to mere platitudes, we must never, ever forget that he died a revolutionary. After Selma, after the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts had been passed, King declared that the time had come to forge a new path. He told a reporter, "For years I labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of society. A little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values," end quote. Frustrated by white resistance to addressing in any meaningful way decaying ghettos, failing schools, structural joblessness, and crippling poverty, Dr. King said, quote, "The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against that injustice, not against the lives of their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to lift the load of poverty," end quote. In the final months of Dr. King's life, he was committed to organizing the poor people's movement, uniting poor people of all colors in a movement for economic justice and basic human rights. His plan was to bring thousands of people to Washington, D.C., and literally shut the city down until President Johnson and Congress and the American public was forced to take seriously a program of action to eliminate poverty, guarantee quality of education, and the right to work at a living wage. He vowed to shut our nation's capital down and keep it paralyzed until our national leaders took meaningful action. He told his staff at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who were concerned that the civil rights movement had lost its steam and direction, that the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to decent housing, the right to quality education. Without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King, I hope we will do more than celebrate him. I hope we will commit ourselves to building a truly revolutionary human rights movement for justice. A movement for education, not incarceration, for jobs, not jails. A movement to end all forms of legal discrimination against people with criminal records, discrimination that deny people basic human rights to work, to shelter, to education, to food. A movement that will transform our police departments from warriors to peace officers. A movement that will end not only mass incarceration, but also mass deportation. one that values the dignity and humanity of us all, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we may have done. A movement that challenges us to respond with greater care, compassion, and concern to those we view as the others. If you doubt that a major social movement is necessary today, if you think that surely there must be some other way to solve this problem, that we can just tinker with this criminal justice machine and get it right, surely we don't need a new movement, do we? If you're tempted to imagine that something less will do, consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration that we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement gained steam, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would have to find a new line of work. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that are quite vulnerable economically. These communities have been sold on prisons as an answer to their economic woes. And very often these prisons are advertised as providing these vulnerable communities with way more benefits than they actually deliver. But nonetheless, these communities come to believe that their livelihood, their survival depends on these prisons. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange would be forced into bankruptcy. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure, it's not going to just fade away, downsize out of sight, without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Of course, there are those who say, oh, well, there's no hope of ending mass incarceration in America. There's no hope that we'll ever get to the promised land. No hope that Dr. King's dream will ever be fulfilled. We will always be bitter and divided, punishing the others. Just as many were resigned to Jim Crow in the South and would say, oh yeah, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. I find that today, many people view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails as just an unfortunate but basically inalterable fact of American life. Well, I'm certain that Dr. King and Ella Baker and Sojourner Truth and the many others who risked their lives to end earlier forms of racial and social control would not be so easily deterred. So it's time for us to take the baton. We must be willing to continue the work. We must be willing to go back and pick up where they left off and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. Now, what must we do to build this movement? That's a question I'm often asked. Well, first, I believe we've got to begin by telling the truth, the whole truth. It's an unpopular truth. It's an inconvenient truth. But it's the truth nonetheless. We've got to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to rebirth a caste-like system. And we've got to be willing to tell this truth in our classrooms, on our campuses, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our places of worship. We've got to be willing to tell this truth so that a great awakening can begin. Because unlike the old Jim Crow, there are no signs alerting you to the existence of this new caste system. The whites-only signs are gone. And if you personally have not been affected by this system, if this system doesn't govern you, if this system doesn't ensnare your brother, your sister, your nephew, it's easy to go your whole life and have no idea what is going on. So if we are going to build this movement, we're going to have to commit ourselves to telling the truth and pulling back the curtain and help to make visible what has been hidden in plain sight. But of course, just telling the truth and holding forums and study circles is necessary. By itself, it's insufficient. We have also got to be willing to get to work. And that means building an underground railroad for people who've been released from prison. An underground railroad for people who want to make a genuine break for real freedom and need help and support finding work, shelter, reunification with their families, who are hungry and need food. We need to build an underground railroad to help all those young people who are now destined for prison rather than college, providing tutoring and mentoring and support. But of course, building the Underground Railroad on its own is not enough either. Just as during the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to shuttle a few one by one to freedom. You had to be willing to work for abolition. Well, today it's not enough just to mentor and tutor and help and support people one by one. You got to be willing to work for the abolition of this system as a whole. And that means ending the drug war as we know it, once and for all. Ending it. Ending it. We have spent $1 trillion waging the drug war since it began. You know, you constantly hear, well, there's not enough money to pay our teachers. There's not enough money for jobs programs for our young people. There's not enough money for job training or economic investment. Well, we had $1 trillion to burn. And we invested it in building prisons and cages for our young people rather than investing in their communities, in their futures, and in their dreams. Enough. It's time that we treat drug addiction and drug abuse as a public health problem rather than a crime, and invest all the money we save back into the communities that have been harmed the most. And we've also got to end all these forms of legal discrimination against people who've been released from prison, discrimination that have denied them basic human rights to work and to shelter and to food. We have got to end the criminalization of immigration, and we have got to shift from a purely punitive model of dealing with violence to a restorative and transformative model for justice, and invest in the communities that are hardest hit by high rates of violent crime. We have got a lot of work to do. And you might think this sounds like too much, like it's impossible. You might think that there's no way for us to tackle all of this. It's just too overwhelming. Well, keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, policies, and practices that comprise this system of mass incarceration, they all rest upon one core belief. And it's the same core belief that sustained Jim Crow. It's the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. Some lives just don't matter. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born. A movement that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. And it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic. Because although this drug war may have been born with black folks in mind, it's a war that has destroyed the lives of people and communities of all colors. A white kid living in rural Indiana who is facing a prison sentence for drug addiction, who can't afford the drug treatment he desperately needs, he's suffering because of a drug war declared with black folks in mind. And we see that the same punitive impulse and mindset that gave rise to the drug war and birthed mass incarceration is now aimed at another group of people, at another prison building boom, as immigrants have been targeted as the others. So we have got to be willing to connect the dots and build a multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement on behalf of all of us. We stand at a fork in the road. We can continue with business as usual, politics as usual, or we can choose the other path, the one that is less clearly marked with many boulders, brush, and perils along the way. On this path, you have to make a way out of no way, blaze a trail where no markings can be found. But it's the only path that will eventually take us to higher ground, a place where we can finally escape the cycles of division and creating caste-like systems in America. It's easy to get lost on this path if you don't have a good moral compass. But if we do, and if we act with courage, we will end this system and help to ensure that nothing like it is ever created again. I hope and pray that we rise to this challenge, the challenge this moment in history presents, and when choosing which way to go, we will embrace King's revolutionary consciousness and be guided by his moral compass. For the notion that all human beings are truly created equal with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, remains a revolutionary idea. Let it be said that 2015 was the year that King's revolution finally was born, the nonviolent revolution he prayed for and died for. Finally, the sleeping giant woke up, got up, and walked, and chose the road less traveled. And that, I believe, one day historians will say, ultimately made all the difference. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alexander, for a wonderfully enlightening, thought-provoking, and hopefully action-initiating conversation. We will begin our question and answer session. I will be your moderator. I'm Dr. Crystal Shannon from the School of Nursing. I would like to encourage as many people as possible to stay for the question and answer session and prepare some quality questions to ask our author. She's given us a wonderful amount of time to discuss a lot of the topics that she's presented in her presentation and any questions that the audience may have. I would like to cover a couple of housekeeping things first as we begin. As many of you may know, we are live streaming this event to many of our other IU campuses. So we will be receiving questions from those campuses. I will be receiving them from our Office of Diversity via email, and then I'll be relaying those to Professor Alexander. We have a couple of microphones in the aisles, so if everyone can please present your question to the individual microphones and organize an orderly line, that would be great. In the interest of time, please prepare your questions in advance. You can actually jot them down on the programs that you have. That way you can ask your question clearly and present it to Professor Alexander. When it is your turn, please come to the microphone, introduce yourself. If you are one of our students, if you could at least present that you are a student and what class or what school you're from, that would be fabulous. And then we also have people that are in our overflow room in the Berglund Auditorium that are also preparing questions as well. So, Professor Alexander, you have a lot of questions that will be coming this way. So as you begin developing your questions and coming to the microphone, we can actually begin with our first question. We'll take it here from the right.
Hi.
Okay, Michelle,
Yes.
as you have eloquently spoken concerning mass incarceration and how Black lives matter, as we embark upon one of the nation's biggest events, which is the Super Bowl this year, that showcases many African American players, I want to know, how do you differentiate how Black lives do matter as it relates to the millions or thousands of African American NCAA basketball players who rack in millions and millions of dollars for Division I schools? So how do you differentiate how Black lives matter as it relates to African American basketball players, football players who rack in millions and millions of dollars for the universities?
Well, I think it's always been clear that When black people are able to make an institution a lot of money, they're valued by that institution. They may not be valued by being paid well, because certainly in college sports they're not. But you do see that they are treated as heroes and glamorized in ways that help, I think, to seduce us into a view that black people, black athletes are celebrated and appreciated. But you know, it's nothing new to have institutions profiting in a big way off of black labor of all kinds. What we see, you know, in sports today is perhaps a more glaring example of it than in other areas. But I think what the emphasis on athletes, you know, in our public culture often displays is a desperation for us to have heroes and people we can cheer for. And we also see institutions that are more than eager to profit from their work and their dedication on the field in ways that often aren't rewarded or shared with the community at large. Yes.
Thank you. Next question.
Dr. Alexander, my sister, I want to first say welcome, and then thank you for a seminal and practical piece of work. You'll understand when I say that Gary is Ferguson, Hammond is Ferguson, Jackson, Tennessee is Ferguson, where my son was murdered, shot in the back by police, November 6, 2014. You don't know that name because it's still being covered up. Your intellect and your insight are informed, as we heard, by grassroots experience earlier in your life. Could you please speak to the importance and significance of that, particularly for our young people, the significance of, especially at this moment, getting involved, getting engaged now and not later?
Absolutely. You know, there are many, many ways in which you can contribute to the movement. You don't have to be a grassroots organizer in order to contribute to the movement. If you're an artist, then let your art serve the movement. If you are a doctor, then use your skills and access and talent in ways that will help to persuade us to view drug addiction and drug abuse as a public health problem like alcoholism rather than a crime. If you're a teacher, you can most certainly serve the movement. No matter what work you find yourself in, there are so many ways for you to serve the movement. But as you point out, there is no way that we are going to force our nation to reckon with itself and chart a new course if we are not also willing from time to time to take action, to actually take to the streets, to show up to meetings with your church or your faith community to organize, that there is no substitute for that. And certainly what we've seen in the history of the civil rights movement, as we look at the history of abolitionism, time and time again we've seen that change comes when people refuse to cooperate with the system as is and devise a vision, a plan, and a strategy for achieving their goals. And certainly my work, directing the Racial Justice Project and particularly working in Oakland, helped me to see the absolute necessity of developing a clear vision, goals, and being willing to get out into communities, partnering with them, not simply helping them, but partnering with them, learning from them, working with them to achieve transformational change. And so it doesn't mean that everyone here has to be a grassroots organizer, but it does mean that those who have dedicated themselves to the work of grassroots organizing, and we need far more people who are willing to do that, when they make the call to show up at this church and attend the meeting, when they say we're going to have a demonstration downtown at such and such a time, be willing to go. don't just tweet about it or hope to catch it on the news. Be willing to actually take to the streets, to go to the meeting, and to join in the movement in a direct way. I think, unfortunately, with many of the advances in technology, it's easy to imagine that you're making a big difference just by liking something on Facebook or tweeting it out an article and some videos or showing something on YouTube. And yes, sharing the truth is part of the work that needs to be done, but it is not a substitute for actually being willing to get out there into the streets, into your community, and commit yourself to real action. So thank you so much for your question.
Okay, it's more of a question. Now that you mentioned about Facebook, is how I found out about you during the Ferguson incident. I had a friend, I ended up friending someone named Crystal Tyler who written a book called Wheat Money, which give how it's discriminated with blacks, where back in 1865 when slavery was abolished, how you had a poor white family that was given the opportunity with land versus a black family that didn't have that same opportunity. And drugs was induced to him more so you uplifted the whites.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you.
Professor Alexander, I have a question from our IUPUI, which is Indiana University, Purdue University, and Indianapolis campus. This is the multicultural center that's viewing the stream. The question is, do you think the Southern Poverty Law Center's recruit successful prison lawsuits will be effective in setting precedent beyond to states involved? They offered an example of such as the federal level.
I'm not sure which Southern Poverty Law Center lawsuit they're referring to, so I can't speak to that particular litigation. In my book, I talk a little bit about the over-reliance on litigation as a method of addressing racial injustice and the many barriers that now exist in our court system to, responding to the injustices that we have through litigation. But I can't speak to that particular case. I do know that there is a critically important role for lawyers to play even today, just as, in the era of Plessy versus Ferguson, when separate but equal was the law, lawyers had a very important role to play in developing a legal strategy that would eventually overturn Plessy versus Ferguson and result in Brown versus Board of Education. So although I believe grassroots organizing and action is fundamental, I do believe there is a role for litigation and lawyers, a necessary role for lawyers in litigation in the movement.
I do have another question offered by the same campus. What do you see as the connection between mass incarceration and changing approaches to state-sponsored mental health care?
And changing approaches to state-sponsored
mental health care.
Well, that's a great question. I think a lot of people don't realize that, after the movement was born to close down many mental institutions in the United States, a movement that was inspired by the horrific treatment of many people who had mental health challenges and were kept in truly inhumane conditions and subjected to all kinds of treatments that caused more harm than good. Efforts were made to shut those facilities down, but unfortunately, many of those folks, particularly poor people with mental health challenges, aren't able to get the support and the treatment that they need in their communities, and therefore wind up on the streets and in the criminal justice system. We see that today our prison system often serves as the primary mental health care provider for poor communities and communities of color in this country. And, that itself is an extraordinary crisis which needs to be addressed. I think it reflects our tendency to respond to problems, real problems that exist in communities related to poverty or lack of education or mental health challenges or drug addiction or drug abuse with a purely punitive impulse. There's the saying that if all you've got is a hammer, that everything looks like a nail. And, what we've seen over the last 40 years as our nation has been engulfed in this war mentality and this get tough orientation is a tendency to just lock people up who are faced with real challenges and can't get the kind of support and quality attention that they need and deserve in their communities.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have another question, and this is from our overflow room in the Berglund Auditorium. The person wrote, I am a nursing student, and I was wondering, how can we as a country get away from biases against not just African Americans, but all other races when racism and discrimination have gone on for so long?
I'm sorry, say the second part of the question.
They asked, I am a nursing student, and I was
Yes.
wondering, how can we as a country get away from biases against not just African Americans, but all races when racism has gone on for so long?
Well, I think it's critically, we can't wave a magic wand and have people suddenly see the dignity and humanity in one another. But when people who have been the target of bias and mistreatment find their own voice and their own courage and stand up and begin to act on their own behalf, telling their stories, organizing for justice, it forces a public conversation. I don't know how many people have seen Selma here, the film Selma. But what you see there is that when those who were oppressed, who had no rights, could not vote, could be legally discriminated against, were considered to be less than human, genetically inferior, when they stood up, organized, and created a crisis that the nation had to reckon with and respond to, and when they acted with nonviolence and demonstrated with their own bodies and their own action and their own advocacy, their own humanity and dignity, it creates a situation in which the country is forced to respond. And we have seen recently, the events following Ferguson and the refusal to indict the officer who killed Eric Garner. We have seen young people of all colors in the streets with signs, Black Lives Matter, forcing a conversation about whether we do or do not truly value the lives of all people. It has forced a conversation about our biases and stereotypes. And one of King's primary strategies was to use nonviolence as a tool to create conflict and creative tension that would open up a space to have the kinds of conversations, debates, and dialogues that are necessary. And, in recent years, civil rights lawyers like myself have too often tried to, take the easiest route to get to your goal. You think to yourself, oh, well, I need this law changed or that law changed. Can I call up a legislator and have a private meeting with them? And then maybe we can get it changed through a backroom deal. And of course, that is tempting to find ways to change the law as quickly, as easily as you can. But our challenge is not simply to change the law, but to change public consciousness. And so in thinking about our strategies and our advocacy and how we go about our work and how we talk to one another, I think we have to keep in mind that over and over again, our goal is simply not to just tinker with this machine and change a few laws here and there, but to force the kinds of difficult, challenging conversations that will, force a reckoning with our past and our present, but also will help to humanize the people that we have been, too quick to other. I personally believe that creating a lot more room for formerly incarcerated people and their families to take leadership in the emerging movement and for their stories to be heard and told is absolutely essential. We've seen the power, the transformative power of, undocumented young people speaking up and telling their stories, and how that has helped to capture the imagination of the American public. It's one thing to say, well, ship them all back. But then when you see a young person who says, well, I was brought here when I was 5, and I'm in college now, and I want a chance, suddenly it's not as easy. You're talking about a real person, not a number, not a statistic, not an other. And, in recent years, We've heard a lot about the criminals from politicians and law enforcement, but how often do you get to hear them tell their stories in the media? How often do you get to hear their experience, their perspective, hear about the ways in which they may want to make amends? And so as long as those who have been demonized and labeled never get a chance to be heard, then it will be easy for us to believe the worst possible things about them and reduce them to the worst thing they've ever done. Daniel Hunter has created an organizing manual based on my book, which will soon be available, and it talks about, in great detail, strategies that ordinary folks can take to try to dismantle the new Jim Crow, and among them is helping to ensure that the people who have been most harmed have a voice and have an opportunity to take leadership in this movement. And I think that is one of the most important strategies for shifting public consciousness and changing the ways that we view each other and the biases that we carry.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi, Professor Alexander. My name is Reverend John Jackson, and I want to say it's good to see you again. I work with Dr. Ivor Carruthers and the Proctor Conference, and we had a chance to dialogue a couple of years ago then. I also mentioned that I am a former housing police officer in Chicago. And one of the things that I saw, I want to ask you to comment on, one of the things I experienced that was devastating are sweeps. And black elected officials need to change from a strategy that feeds into the get tough and the sweeping to try to deal with what they see as a criminal problem, a crime problem in community, but the detrimental aspect of sweeps. And then just real quick, just want to ask, have you read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy?
Just Mercy, an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Yes, excellent. And you're absolutely right that the sweeps in poor communities of color help to drive not only the racial disparities, but the numbers, the volume of people that we see being locked up, and should be among our first priorities. In fact, one of my big concerns is that Attorney General Eric Holder recently announced a change in the funding structure for in drug forfeiture laws. And I talk about in the book about how drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep for their own use up to 80% of the cars, cash, homes seized from suspected drug offenders, giving them a direct monetary interest in the drug war itself. And Eric Holder announced changes to drug forfeiture policies, but carved out an exception for multi-jurisdictional task forces. And it's those multi-jurisdictional task forces that are responsible for the kinds of drug sweeps that we've seen that have resulted in some of the egregious abuses in Tulia and elsewhere. And if we're going to get at the problems of sweeps and these drug task forces, then we're going to have to close that gaping loophole and ensure that we're no longer funding by our federal government really dragnet programs in inner city communities.
Hi, my name is Crystal O'Brien. I am an employee here at IU, and I'm also the vice president for the Young Professionals, the Urban League Young Professionals in this area. So I am one of those grassroots organizers, and
Excellent.
I am definitely supporting everything that you're saying and doing. My question is, how do you pose to diversify this message, moving it from the black problem to a human problem? And how do we connect these dots to make the message relevant and piercing enough for the other groups to actually move on the issue with us?
That's a beautiful question.
You know I was right there while you were still talking.
Yes. I mean, I don't think it's easy, but one of the ways in which that we can move in that direction is by connecting the dots between issues and causes. I mentioned mass deportation, and I find that very often, black folks will say, oh, mass incarceration is a big problem, but mass deportation? I don't want those immigrants taking my job. we have to take a deep breath and pause right there, you know. Much of the backlash against the civil rights movement was driven by fear among poor and working class whites who themselves were struggling for their own survival, that if now black folks had equal rights, they would be taking their jobs. That same fear that, well, if they get access to the mainstream economy, what's going to happen to me? That almost crabs in a barrel mentality, right? That we have to take a deep breath and say, yes, we deserve the right to work for a fair wage, and we deserve access to equal education. But these are basic human rights that every human being should have. And I should not allow myself to feel threatened by someone who, you know, came across the border and I'm worried they're going to take my job. You were born here as an American citizen. What did you do to earn your citizenship? You're born here. None of us deserve basic human rights more than another. We may have legal rights that others do not, but we all share basic human rights to dignity, and we ought to extend care and compassion to concern to one another. And so I would hope that, you know, one of the ways is for us to begin to reach out and demonstrate support for one another's causes, for those who are working on prison reform, to demonstrate their solidarity for those who are working to reform our nation's immigration laws, and also to demonstrate support and solidarity for those who are working with poor white communities, and to say we are all together in a movement for economic justice and basic human rights. We're in this together. And if we succeed in dismantling, you know, the new Jim Crow and this new caste system, it will only be because we have created a new moral consensus about how all human beings ought to be treated, what we are all deserving of. And we can demonstrate that by showing our support for the movement, work, causes, and concerns of other groups. So thank you for your work.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Constance Cox Pena. I'm a senior here at IUN, and I'm a participant of the IUN Student Support Services Trio program, which gave away your book free to each one of us. In your book, The New Jim Crow, you use a metaphor called the bird cage as a way to describe structural racism and apply that to the mass incarceration. How does what is happening in school systems in the United States affect African American and Latino youth pertain to the metaphor of that bird cage?
Excellent question. Thank you. Thank you so much. In the book, I refer to structural racism as a bird cage, saying that you can be trapped in a cage. You can be trapped by structural racism, even if each wire of the cage was not designed specifically with the purpose of keeping you trapped. As long as lots of rules, policies, practices, attitudes, customs form in a way that keep you trapped, they don't all have to be designed intentionally for the purpose of keeping you in your place. And certainly in our education system today, our education system, which is still largely separate and still grossly unequal, we see a maze of rules, laws, policies, and practices that operate to keep many kids trapped. And although those rules and laws may not have all been designed for the purpose of keeping them trapped, they have that effect. And one of the rules and laws that I'm most deeply disturbed by is the rule that apportions funding for schools and school districts based on property taxes. This to me seems to be one of the most egregious violations of the notion that all of us are created equal with certain human rights, including the right to an education. If you choose to organize a funding system based on property taxes, you know who will get one kind of education and who will be getting another. But the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that there is no fundamental right to education in our Constitution. And that's why I think that Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely right when he said it's time to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. We need a new framework. And, you know, he also talked about the need for America to be born again. And in my view, that means us reimagining even what our Constitution ought to be guaranteeing to us. And I believe our Constitution should look a lot more like the South African Constitution, which out of their upheaval had the foresight to guarantee both basic civil rights and basic human rights in their Constitution. Now, of course, it's easy to put rights on paper and much more difficult to implement them in reality. But here in this nation, we haven't even taken the step of affording basic human rights like quality, equal and quality education on paper, you know, as part of our basic constitutional values. So thank you so much for your question.
Hi, Professor Alexander. I have a question from our Bloomington campus, and this is a student question in the Office of Diversity and Equity. Drug addiction and violence are continually damaging Black communities. How do we combat those issues and improve our communities without incarceration? Is there a more effective way to reach and protect the public?
Yes. Yes, there absolutely is. And you know, there's a program known as Operation Ceasefire that has been successful in a number of urban areas, and many people are often startled that it works. And Operation Ceasefire is premised on the notion that if you give gang members and young people in these high crime communities and neighborhoods the opportunity to choose between continuing the path that they're on and having a job and an opportunity to get to a different place in their life, that they'll actually choose the job and the other path. And many people, you know, are shocked that when law enforcement and community leaders call in gang members and people who have been involved in serious crimes in their community and say, we will give you a job and meaningful opportunity and support if you lay down your gun and your arms, that many, many do. And it's possible to bring down crime rates without simply locking folks up and having that as your first response. And, you know, I think in reality we have to be honest that, you know, when you take a look at the communities that suffer from high rates of violent crime, they are also the same communities where a war has been declared. They have been treated as an enemy, and they have come to embrace violence as a way of life. And much as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, you know, our nation is in a difficult place to condemn violence when we are the greatest perpetrators of violence around the world. Those were his words. We also have to recognize that as a nation, if we are waging wars on poor communities of color, it is difficult to stand back and then say to them, why the violence? So we have got to be able to find ways of responding to the real problems in their communities by investing in education, job training, job creation, and providing support and meaningful opportunities for young people. It's one thing to say, put your gun down, act right, pull your pants up, and begin the lecture, if you're not also offering a meaningful path out. And so, yes, there are ways to do it, ways that have been successful, and I think it's not a matter of whether we can do it, but whether we can muster the willingness to commit ourselves to the other path. So thank you.
Thank you. I also have another question from our overflow room, the Berglund Auditorium. The question states, what is the impact, if any, of the term diversity on advocacy for social justice and prison reform?
Yes, well, in the last chapter of my book, I talk about the ways in which cosmetic diversity, what I refer to as cosmetic diversity, and affirmative action programs that have, the tendency to kind of sprinkle people of color in elite institutions help to create the appearance of much more racial progress than has actually been achieved. And this appearance of great racial progress in many ways can actually hinder movements to galvanize the public for meaningful reform, because this cosmetic diversity, which does not address any of the root causes of the need for these interventions and affirmative action plans, this cosmetic diversity ends up being a justification for telling poor people and people of color, well, you too could make it if you try. You too could be like Barack Obama if you would just pull your pants up and stay in school. Now, of course, the reality is that Barack Obama himself, President Obama himself, did drugs. Quite a bit of them, as a matter of fact. If you actually read President Obama's memoir in some of his interviews, he was doing a fair amount of illegal drugs, and actually, as he put it, was heading down a path. As he put it, as being potentially a pothead. Okay? President Obama did a fair amount of drugs in his youth, experimented with drugs. Now, if he had not been raised by a white mother or white grandparents in Hawaii, if he had been raised as a black kid in the hood, the odds are very, very good he would have been stopped, he would have been frisked, he would have been searched. And far from being president of the United States today, he might not even have the right to vote, depending on what state he lived in. So rather than just blaming and shaming kind of young people who make the kinds of mistakes that all young people typically make in their lives, we have to ensure that youthful mistakes do not derail our young people for life. And I think that's what we really have to commit ourselves to, is resisting the temptation to allow cosmetic diversity become an excuse or a rationalization from doing the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of color, and also to recognize that, that common response that, oh, well, you did the crime. If you did the crime, you might as well do the time. Well, don't complain if you actually did the crime. We all make mistakes. We've all broken the law at some point in our lives. But only some people are forced to pay for their mistakes for the rest of their lives. And I think part of what it means to have white privilege in the United States is to have the freedom to make mistakes and go on with your life. And that is a privilege that shouldn't be taken away from white folks. It's a privilege all of us should have, to be able to make mistakes, to be human, and yet change course and go on with our lives.
Thank you.
My name's Autumn Seiler. I'm a junior here at IUN, and I just want to start off by saying that I truly believe that God has created everyone equal, but not everyone can understand and comprehend the same thing that I think. So my question is, how do you recommend that we open someone's mind who has it embedded in their head that one race is superior to the other? Or how do you recommend that we engage in them to open their minds and eyes to this very serious problem? It doesn't have to be too elaborate, just like the start of like breaking the ice. You know what I mean?
I think I think there's a number of possible approaches. And I don't know how familiar you are or might be with Tim Wise's work. Have you heard of Tim Wise?
No.
Tim Wise has written a book called Dear White People, and it is also a book, a number of books that are basically about having conversations about race, white people having conversations about race with other white people, and how critically important it is, how difficult it is, but that it's possible. And so I think I refer you, no, actually I don't mean to be.
No, it's okay.
I refer you to some, and all of you, to some of Tim Wise's work and other people who have done tremendous amount of work around dismantling white privilege and having conversations around race and dispelling kind of the notions of superiority that still exist on a conscious or subconscious level. But I think one of the most important things is just not to give up. One of the experiences that I've had, in recent years is that I'll have a conversation with someone and go into, the arguments about how the system is structured, blah, blah, and they'll just say, you're crazy, why are you saying, blah, 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 and we'll argue and argue. And then years later, I'll run into them again. And they'll say, you know what? I've been thinking about what you said, and I saw this on the news, and I talked, and I'm starting to see things differently. You're not going to change anyone's mind in one conversation, obviously, but by planting the seeds and continuing the dialogue and never giving up and encouraging them to actually go and experience other people in other communities rather than viewing them from a distance, I think is absolutely important. Very often, like I said earlier, it's easy to have opinions, stereotypes, and judgments about people you never hear from, never speak to, and don't know. But when you have the opportunity to actually meet and engage with them, your views can change. And so for those people who might imagine their own superiority to those who are cycling in and out of prisons and jails, I encourage them to actually go to those communities and serve them. And then as you learn their stories, ask yourself how much better you think you might do walking in their shoes. And very often, it's a humbling answer. Thank you so much for your question.
Hello, my name is Laurel Kilpatrick. I'm an instructor at Purdue University Calumet, Hammond, Indiana, in sociology. And many of our students are here, and we are glad for the opportunity to be here. I want to go back to something that you said earlier about these young people in these communities being armed for war or being at war, right? Having war declared on them. And a question from a community member is that these kids are in fact armed, right? They're being just like the brothers and sisters in the continent of Africa being armed with guns and machetes and all of these other weapons. These kids are actively being armed. They don't manufacture guns. Right? They don't have poppy fields. They don't have access to that. And one of the questions that were one of the statements that you made about truth, who, not that you know directly, but who is doing the arming of these young people? Who is actually the ones bringing in these drugs? And at what point do we start to tell the truth about that? Because when we talk about justice, as my favorite entertainer, Ziggy Marley says, freedom is fine. People need justice. And I think the justice starts with the truth and culpability. The culpability doesn't stop with these kids, even though after being armed and after being infused with these drugs and everything else, horrible things are done, right? But where does the justice come in? Where does the culpability actually start?
Yes, that's an important question. And I think, very often we as a nation have that tendency to look at the young kid with the gun and say, you're the problem. We don't ask, how did he get the gun and where did those drugs actually come from? And let's begin to trace this back in a way. And, the drug war itself, many people imagine that the drug war is aimed primarily at the drug kingpins. Absolutely not. The overwhelming majority of those who are arrested and swept up and who are targeted are the folks who are hustling on the street corner, making less than minimum wage on the street corner. That's one of the big myths, is that you can get rich on the street corner. Well, studies have actually shown that the number of hours young people put in on those street corners and the amount of money they actually return, often significantly less than minimum wage, and they're risking their life doing it. But I suggest in answering your question that you take a look at the work, if you haven't already, of Gary Webb, who wrote Dark Alliance. Gary Webb was a San Jose Mercury News reporter who first uncovered and reported on kind of the CIA's link to the drug smuggling that was going on with the CIA's knowledge and lack of intervention from Latin America onto the streets of Los Angeles. The crack that first hit the streets of Los Angeles came to this country with the CIA's knowledge, and they chose not to intervene because of what they described as their foreign policy interests. And there is a story to be told about the ways in which, the U.S. government has both looked the other way and facilitated large-scale drug dealing in the United States for, various reasons of their own. And I think it is a story that's important, had to be told. After Gary Webb published his series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News, he was fired. And many, news agencies around the country, discredited Gary Webb and said he was wrong and, out there in left field. But since then, the CIA has actually admitted that, the bulk of what Gary Webb was reporting was true, and that it was aware of the drug trafficking that was occurring across borders and could have intervened and chose not to. So Gary Webb's work, I think, is a place to start in answering many of those questions. And I think we should be concerned that so little attention has been paid to those who facilitate the large-scale movement of drugs and arms into our country.
And one more comment, it's not a question, but something you said struck me about the crabs in the barrel, because we often use that analogy. And I heard something interesting, that the natural environment for a crab is not a barrel. So their behavior in the barrel is compulsory, right?
Yes.
So we kind of have to take the crabs out of the barrel, or the crabs have to figure out a way to break the barrel to see what their natural environment is and what their natural behavior is.
Amen. Thank you for that.
My name is Courtney Dunn. I'm actually a junior here at IUN in the social work department. And as a social work student, we are taught that we can change policies. We are taught that we have to advocate not just for the underprivileged, but for everybody. So I guess my question is, on the event of changing a policy, or on the event of advocating, getting to try and make that change, maybe not on the macro level, but even on the micro or the meso level, what can we on a student basis do?
Well, there's a whole host of things that can be done, but I want to back up and address what I think I heard in the beginning of your question or statement, which is being taught the importance of advocating on behalf of everyone and not a particular group. And I hope I have made abundantly clear in my work, in my book, that it's absolutely essential for us to build alliances across race, across class, to build a movement that unifies us all and shows appreciation and recognition for the struggles of all people of all colors. But I also think that can sometimes be misinterpreted, those sentiments can be misinterpreted as saying, well, we can't focus on race, or we can't focus on the experience of black people because that's somehow ignoring or denying the suffering of others. And I hope that when we work for all people, it means that we also pay meaningful attention and concern to the specific and distinct struggles and challenges of different racial groups and ethnic groups as well, and not imagine that simply a rising tide will lift all boats, because it doesn't often lift all boats. And there's a danger in imagining that if we just work for universal policies that will benefit us all, that we'll all be fine and we don't have to talk about race or deal with the specific concerns of individual racial groups. And I don't believe that to be the case. And I don't think history bears that out. But to go back to what exactly the types of things students can do, there have been such inspiring work going on by students around the country as of late. There have been not only organizing forums and extensive kind of consciousness raising activity, not only on campus, but also out in the communities that the campuses are located in. But students have also been organizing divestment campaigns. As you may know, divestment campaigns help to bring down the apartheid government in South Africa, organizing the U.S. government and U.S. corporations to divest from South Africa. Well, today, Students are organizing to have their universities or their colleges or their faith communities, their churches, divest from private prisons. The United Methodist Church the National United Methodist Church announced, I guess it was last year, that they were divesting from private prisons. And you might say, why in the world were they investing in private prisons in the first place? Well, most private prisons are now private prison companies are part of mutual fund packages and investment portfolios, and very often people don't even realize that private prison companies are part of these investment portfolios and packages. You have to read the fine print and look at the packages, see, is it actually invested in private prisons? And campaigns to divest from private prisons have been taking off at many universities and faith communities around the country. There have been students who have been organizing against the drug war on campuses, students that have been doing work to reform the rules and policies regarding who is guaranteed admission at their university. People with criminal records, are they being discriminated against in access to admission, or are they given the opportunity to attend? I think there are multiple ways in which students right where you are can begin to engage in organizing, consciousness raising, and activism, both on campus and off. I also encourage students to think about partnering with community organizations, getting off campus into communities, both volunteering and partnering with groups that are doing work in local communities as well. If that kind of activity isn't already underway here, then I think there's an opportunity to get together, even a small group of people, and say, where do we begin? How can we begin to raise consciousness, work with the local community, and begin to get some meaningful organizing and activism happening right here where we are? And so I hope that you and others, will begin that process if it hasn't already begun.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Alexander. My name is Brittany Jackson. I am a student at Purdue University, Calumet, studying sociology as well as human development and family services. Earlier, you referenced policies within the educational system that help facilitate the inequality that leads to the making of a prison population. The question I pose you is, how do you suggest that we as parents combat the zero tolerance policies taking root in the American public school system that forces black male children into the school to prison pipeline at a rate 6 times that of their white counterparts?
Yes. One of the little known facts about the drug war is that the first zero tolerance policies that made its way into manuals and national policy were actually lifted from DEA manuals. The Drug Enforcement Agency, if you actually look at the origins of zero tolerance, it began with zero tolerance zones for drugs. In the early days of the drug war, there was this move to have zero tolerance for drugs in our communities, and there would be zones created, around schools or particular areas, saying we have zero tolerance for drugs. It was this purely punitive, no second chances, you're caught and you're out. That mentality and literally the language from DE manuals on zero tolerance found their way into our school discipline policies. The war mentality, seeped into our school systems so that our young people were no longer to be helped and supported as they were having challenges that caused them to act out or be disruptive. They were no longer young people to be nurtured and supported and worked with. They were to be gotten rid of. And that mentality, viewing even our young people as the enemy, has had disastrous consequences, as so many of those young people who have been kicked out for their first offense, zero tolerance, you're out, found their way onto the streets and into our prison system. I think it's absolutely essential for parents educators to join forces around ending these zero tolerance policies and work together with organizations like the Advancement Project and the Children's Defense Fund, which has created lots of resources, toolkits, guides for engaging in advocacy to end zero tolerance policies and dismantle the school to prison pipeline. So I encourage you and others to form those kinds of advocacy groups and coalitions and take guidance from some of the national organizations that are leading the way on these issues.
Hi, my name is Ruth Needleman. I am a professor emerita from here at IUN. Thank you for your book.
Thank you.
But I have a question. I've always been told if you want to find what's behind something, to follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say the drug war was pretty much the cause of this mass incarceration.
It started it.
But what was behind starting the drug war? And I think there's a correlation between deindustrialization and this whole new neoliberal regime and the fact that all the inner cities had a lot of surplus black labor.
Mm-hmm.
And white people wanted to move back into center cities because remaking the center city was part of the strategy for redevelopment. You are in one of those cities. We have 40% unemployment, and we have a lot of those people who can't get jobs, can't get driver's license because they have criminal records. Most of the ideas that keep coming forward for how to deal with what was left after the war on drugs was gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
And getting these unemployed people out somewhere. I don't know where they expect them to go. So I'm just wondering if you see, because the drug war, like Jim Crow, was a timely strategy at that point. Is gentrification part of the new Jim Crow?
I think that's an excellent question. And you're absolutely right that the drug war and mass incarceration coincided with deindustrialization and the economic collapse of many working class and poor communities across America. There is absolutely a direct relationship between the two. As there was deindustrialization due to technological innovation, but also hundreds of thousands of jobs being shipped overseas. Suddenly you had hundreds of thousands of people out of work. And we had a choice at that moment. We could have responded with education and economic investment in those communities and all that. And no. Instead, we chose to declare a war on drugs, lock those folks up, no longer needed to labor in factories, no longer needed to pick cotton in the fields. They were viewed and treated as disposable. And we, as a nation, found a way to profit from those black bodies, once again, through a prison system run for profit. So there's an absolute relationship between those. As far as gentrification, I think gentrification is just a reflection of how quickly, when an opportunity presents itself for, people who have money to move in and take advantage of properties and locations and areas that have been decimated due to a drug war or a hurricane or any other factor, how quickly that can occur, and often how powerless the people who have been most harmed feel to resist it. And so I think part of what's needed in our shifting consciousness is a recognition that, we have to have some restorative justice, not just for individual violent crimes, but a sense of reparation and restoration for the communities that have been decimated by the drug war and the Get Tough movement and all of the rest. It's not okay to just allow, people who have to come in and take over those communities and those blocks that have been decimated. You actually have to restore them for the people who have been most harmed. That has to be part of our consciousness of what it means to repair and restore after injustice has occurred. So thank you very much.
Professor Alexander, I have a question from our Southeast campus in New Albany. This is from one of the students that are watching the stream. Are there models of states or cities that have embraced the idea of ending mass incarceration? And if you are aware of some, how have they done it? What have been their successes?
I would like to say that there is some city or state that, had a history of mass incarceration and it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. No. What we have seen is that there have been major gains in some states and some communities. Not an end to mass incarceration, but significant progress and reform. Ironically, one of those states is New York State, which has significantly reduced the rate of incarceration for African American and Latino, drug offenders. After the Rockefeller drug laws were overturned, rates of incarceration for drug offenses came way down from where they were. There's still a significant problem, and as we know, due to the stop and frisk crisis and controversy that exists in New York, there are still tens of thousands of people who get arrested on the streets of New York every year, for possession of small amounts of marijuana. So the problem has not been solved, but you can look and see places and communities that have come together, and in New York actually succeeded in overturning the harsh mandatory minimum sentences that existed as part of the Rockefeller drug laws and seen real gains. In California, you may or may not be aware that there was a ballot initiative that recently passed that decriminalized the simple possession of small amounts of, well, I shouldn't say decriminalized, reduced it from a felony to a civil offense, small amounts of drugs, so that people who had felony convictions for having a small amount of drugs no longer could be saddled with a felony for a simple possession of small quantities of drugs. And beyond that, people who had been arrested and convicted and done time and been saddled with felonies can now go back and have those felonies officially removed from their records. Of course, in the electronic age, it's difficult ever to make a record really go away. But at least California has taken the bold step of saying we are not going to label as a state those people as felons anymore. So there are places where gains have been made, but we have yet to see, I think, the kind of large-scale undoing, dismantling of the system as a whole in any particular place or region.
How you doing, Ms. Michelle Alexander?
Yes.
I want to thank you for coming to our community.
Thank you.
You are as an angel
to
our community and as Americans. My first question, I think Ms. Needleman asked, was there a direct connection between joblessness and poverty to fuel the war on drugs? As we know, this is the city of Gary. It was supposed to be the city of the century. And in the 80s, they had a Great Depression. And a lot of those, I consider young persons that would have been doctors and lawyers and dentists and things like that, got caught up into petty crimes and drugs and things like that. So I think you answered that question. My second question is, did the federal government actually pump drugs into the black and brown communities? You talked about the CIA in Los Angeles or whatever. Is that true?
I am aware of no evidence that the federal government intentionally sought destruction of the black community by pumping guns and drugs into the community. I am aware of no evidence of that nature. Like I said, I think the best research that has been done about the role of the CIA or the federal government, and drug distribution has been done to date by Gary Webb. But I'm not aware of any evidence of that kind.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming to the G and
Thank you.
dialoguing with us.
Thank you.
My name is Jonathan. I'm a student at Purdue Calumet in Hammond. And I kind of want to bring this locally, because locally in this city, in Gary right now, war has been declared as well, as you were saying. And some of my comrades are here now, where we are right now involved in a struggle to end sweeps that take place in this city. Where police officers from many different cities across Northwest Indiana come into Gary,
yes,
pull over folks, give them tickets, all of these different things, which does nothing but perpetuate and add to this mass incarceration which we were talking about. So first, we're having a meeting with the mayor this Friday to address these issues and demand a stop to these sweeps. Many of which sometimes the meetings are held in this exact building to go out and conduct these sweeps. So if you had any advice that we can use here as we go into this meeting with the mayor of Gary Friday, any advice you have. And then my second question is, what role do you think that capitalism as a system that's based off a mass accumulation of wealth plays into mass incarceration or racism? And can racism and those things be ended under capitalism?
Great questions. Well, without knowing a little more about exactly what's happening with these multi-jurisdictional task forces and raids that are occurring here, it's difficult for me to give you specific advice about the meeting with the mayor. But what I will say is this, that in meeting with anyone, not only do you need to be very clear and specific about what you want, not simply, to go in and say, we'd like things to be better, but to be very specific about your goals and what actually would constitute success for you and for your group. What does justice really look like for you, and be able to spell it out with a clear vision. One of the critiques that have been made of many of the protests that have been occurring around the country is that, they're having die-ins here or there, but what do they want? What would justice be? Is it simply getting an indictment of one police officer? Is that justice? Are you done? What are the demands? And there are organizers, the Ferguson United and the Hands Up United groups that have listed their demands, but I think the general public yet doesn't have that sense that they know what the specific demands are of the emerging movement. So being clear about what justice means and looks like is essential. And I would say to be unafraid and asking for what you really want, not simply asking what you think you'll get. If you want an end to multi-jurisdictional task forces and their use in Gary, then to say they ought to be ended in their entirety. And, from my perspective, I believe there should be no drug sweeps of poor communities of color through these multi-jurisdictional task forces. It all should come to an end. And the money that has been spent rounding people up in the streets should be invested back in these communities as well. And so that would be my goal, is to call it off, to end it in its entirety, not to scale it back and to get into the detail, to end it, have it be over, and to talk about what kind of investments are going to be made in the community, what opportunities for drug treatment on demand are going to be provided, et cetera. But also, I think, there is a tendency very often in advocacy work to think, I was very guilty of this as a civil rights organizer, that if I bring all the facts and all the data and I make my case, well then they will be persuaded because they will see the irrationality of the current path. And then it turns out you have your meetings and you explain it and you have your reports and the data and nothing happens. And so I think one of the challenges for any advocacy effort like yours is how to force people to do the right thing. And, I think one of my concerns is a lot of people talk about, well, is Barack Obama doing good, or is he bad, or could he be doing more this and that? And the question is, no, what is Barack Obama the man, President Obama the man doing? The question is, are we creating conditions in which any president would feel compelled to do the right thing? And so how can you create conditions here in Gary so that any mayor would feel compelled to do the right thing? And so that's a challenge. I'm not sure the specific answer, but I'm so grateful for the work and the commitment that you have.
This will be our last question in the interest of time. I know we've gone over our originally scheduled program, but we try to accommodate as many student questions and questions from the other campuses as possible. So the last question.
It's always great to see you, Doctor. Now that several states have legalized drugs and they are making multi-million-dollar businesses, isn't it time for our country to begin to push that people should not be going to jail, not serving prison time, and we see that drugs are not, I guess, messing up everybody's mind and killing people. No longer should we be incarcerated for drugs. If some states have legalized it, then isn't it time to legalize it all over the United States and stop locking up our black young men?
Thank you for that. And I realize I didn't get to the second half of your question, so I'm not going to skip over the second half of your question about capitalism as well. But my view, and I didn't always have this view, but my view today is that we should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs across the board. That we should not be putting people in cages because they were caught with some amount of drugs for personal use. That drug use, abuse, addiction constitute a public health problem, and criminalizing that problem has not worked. Rates of drug addiction and drug abuse have not gone down as a result of 4 decades of declaring a war. They have not gone down, and if we're serious about ending drug addiction, drug abuse, we would be investing massive amounts in drug treatment and ensuring that people had access to support and treatment on demand instead of simply carting people away and branding them criminals and felons. And in Portugal, they have actually decriminalized simple possession of all drugs across the board. Portugal went to a complete decriminalization model, and they've seen rates of drug addiction and drug abuse decline as they have invested in drug treatment and education programs. And they've also seen drug-related crime go down as well. And so, I think there is another path, and I would encourage us to look to what other countries have managed to do as inspiration, that it's possible to choose another path here at home as well. Going back to your question about capitalism and its role, now, is it possible to abolish racism in a society that is so capitalistic, so hyper-capitalistic? I think, the answer is, I don't know. I think what we have seen, throughout our nation's history is that, from the beginning, slavery itself was predicated on greed. It wasn't like we enslaved black people because we hated them. They were enslaved because it was a way to make an enormous amount of money off of cheap, free black labor. And we have seen this cycle played out over and over again as poor people have been exploited over and over again, and as race has been used as a wedge in this country to keep poor and working class folks pitted against each other for the benefit of a few. I think that I probably find myself much in the same place philosophically as where Dr. King left off, where he said we have got to raise very serious questions about our economic system as it exists in the United States. And that doesn't mean saying socialism is the answer or communism is the answer, as those systems have proven to have their flaws as well. But we have to be willing to ask ourselves whether our current economic system is truly providing, equal opportunity and meaningful access to basic human rights for all. And the way capitalism is manifesting itself, not only in the United States, but around the world today, I think, raises significant questions and cause for concern that we have to address as we work for racial justice. So thank you very much for your question.
Okay, this actually concludes our Q&A session, and after, we will be bringing Chancellor Lowe to the stage to offer the closing remarks for our events today. However, after which we will have our book signing. Ms. Alexander will be present to sign any copies of text that you have. So if you can just hold your seats for just a minute while the Chancellor wraps up the closing statements, then we will actually tell you the order of the line so that everyone can actually take the time and speak with the author and have their book signed. Chancellor Lowe.
Thank you, Dr. Shannon. And Professor Alexander, thank you for being with us at Indiana University today to share your work and summon us to engage a pressing issue. You have challenged us all to reflect deeply about not only the complex strands of the situation that has been created, but what we each think about them. And that is where it must start. Because if we want things to turn out differently, we share a common responsibility, individually and collectively, to get to grips honestly with that swirl of ideas and perspectives that always comprise the important issues. As Professor Alexander reminds us, we are all in this together. Thank you also for being with us, Professor Alexander. You've really added something, brought something very special and important to Indiana University today. Thank you very much. And also, thank you to all our colleagues and students at the other Indiana University campuses. Thank you for joining us today and joining in the discussion with Professor Alexander. And before we go, there are a couple of important announcements. First, sincere thanks to all those colleagues who showed their interest in next year's Common Campus Reading by participating in the campus selection poll this month. The One Book Committee has asked me to announce that Operation Homecoming, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Home Front, in the words of U.S. troops and their families, edited by Andrew Carroll and supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, was selected as the IU Northwest book for the 2015-16 One Book, One Campus, One Community Reading Initiative. Now, please look at your program, because there's a door prize. And if you have a red dot affixed to the program, you will receive a free copy of Operation Homecoming. Please take your program to the diversity registration table immediately outside the gymnasium to provide them with your contact information. And I encourage you all to start thinking about Operation Homecoming, perhaps even read it, and how you and our students will be part of the discussion and the dialogue next year. Thank you once again for joining us today. You are all welcome to attend the reception that follows in the Savannah Center lobby, and have your copy of the new Jim Crow signed by Professor Alexander at the north end of the gymnasium, to my right, where you see the very long line that has already established itself. And thank you once again to all of you here and all of those throughout Indiana University who have joined us today. Have a good evening.